Answer this honestly. Why do some men change their lives, and others watch years disappear even though they want it just as badly? Here's a harder question. What if motivation is the reason you keep failing? What if the thing you're waiting for is the exact thing holding you back? Think about that. Because if motivation worked, you wouldn't still be searching for another reset. And if clarity was enough, you would have moved already. So, why haven't you? That question matters more than any advice you've ever heard. Most men believe they're stuck because they haven't found the right plan, the right mindset, or the right moment. But that's not the problem. The problem is what they're relying on. Motivation. Motivation feels powerful, but it's unstable. It rises when life feels easy and disappears the moment resistance shows up. That's not a personal flaw. That's how motivation works. It was never designed to carry responsibility. It was never meant to build a life. Motivation is emotional, temporary, unreliable, and men who build their decisions on emotion eventually collapse under pressure. Here's what no one warns you about. Every time you wait to feel motivated, you train your mind to pause the moment something feels uncomfortable. You don't notice it right away. Nothing breaks, nothing explodes. You still feel capable. You still believe you're disciplined. But quietly, hesitation becomes normal. You start delaying instead of acting, thinking instead of building, planning instead of executing. Days stretch into weeks, weeks into years, and one day you realize you're not behind. You're stuck. Not because you failed, but because you trained yourself to stop. And that's the danger, not a failure. Comfortable delay, because delay feels responsible. It feels patient, it feels smart. But time doesn't care how reasonable you sound. Time only responds to movement. And until you understand that, nothing changes, no matter how badly you want it to. Let me ask you something else. Have you noticed how nothing dramatic has to go wrong for a man's life to stall? No collapse, no disaster, no moment where everything falls apart. Just time, quietly passing. How many years have already gone by where you thought, I'll start soon? Soon after things calm down. Soon after I feel ready. Soon after I figure it out. And here's the uncomfortable question. What if waiting is the reason nothing is changing? Because time doesn't punish loudly. It doesn't threaten you. It doesn't warn you. It just keeps moving. And the most dangerous thing about time is that it feels unlimited, right up until it isn't. Why do you think regret hits so hard later in life? Not because men didn't try, but because they waited. They waited for confidence. They waited for clarity. They waited for permission. And while they waited, time kept collecting interest. Delay compounds, not emotionally, structurally. Every time you postpone action, you don't just lose that day. You reinforce a pattern that says, I act later. And patterns don't stay small, they spread. Waiting becomes normal. Urgency fades, standards soften, and eventually movement feels foreign, not scary, unfamiliar. That's why so many men feel restless but inactive. They want change, they think about change, but their body has learned delay. So let me ask you this. If nothing about your habits changed, if you kept living the same way for the next 5 years, would you respect the man you become? Not admire, not tolerate, respect. That question matters, because time doesn't care about potential. It doesn't reward intention, it rewards movement. Men who build understand this instinctively. They don't wait for certainty, they don't wait to feel aligned. They move first and let clarity catch up later. Because clarity doesn't come from thinking. It comes from motion, and until you accept that, time will keep drifting forward while you stay exactly where you are. So if waiting is the problem, what actually fixes it? Is it trying harder, pushing yourself emotionally, forcing motivation to stay longer? Let me ask you a better question. How often do you argue with yourself before doing the thing you already know you should do? You wake up and debate. You plan and hesitate. You feel resistance and negotiate. That internal conversation is exhausting. And here's the truth most men miss. Discipline isn't about effort. It's about removing the argument. Because the strongest men you know aren't stronger because they feel more motivated. They're stronger because they don't decide every day. They decided once. Think about it. How much energy do you burn just choosing what to do next? when to start, how hard to go, whether today counts. That constant decision-making is why you feel tired, even when you haven't built much. You're not exhausted from work, you're exhausted from choice. Structure fixes that. Structure decides in advance. When you wake up, there's no debate. When resistance shows up, there's no vote. When emotion pushes back, it doesn't get authority. That's why disciplined men move calmly. Not because life is easier, but because fewer things are negotiable. Let me ask you something uncomfortable. What if the reason you keep stalling isn't because you lack discipline, but because you keep giving your emotions a voice? Because every time you ask yourself, do I feel like it? You hand control to something unstable. Feelings change hourly. Standards don't. A disciplined man doesn't wake up asking how he feels. He wakes up knowing what's required. And once requirement replaces feeling, momentum replaces hesitation. That's when action becomes automatic, not forced, not dramatic, just done. And when action becomes automatic, time stops slipping through your hands. Because now, finally, you're moving, whether you feel ready or not. Now let's talk about pressure. Because pressure is where most men finally tell the truth about themselves. Let me ask you this. What happens to your habits when life gets heavy, when stress shows up, when money tightens, when responsibility doesn't give you space to breathe? Do you become sharper, or do your standards disappear? Most men believe pressure creates discipline. It doesn't. Pressure exposes it. When life is calm, anyone can look consistent. Anyone can feel confident. Anyone can stay on track. But pressure strips away the comfort. It removes motivation. It removes energy. It removes excuses. And what's left is whatever you trained when things were easy. That's why pressure feels dangerous to men who rely on emotion. Because when emotion disappears, so does their structure. They panic, they rush, they abandon what worked just to feel relief. And relief is expensive. Relief feels good now and costs you later. Here's a question you need to answer honestly. When pressure hits, do you tighten your standards or loosen them? Do you simplify or do you spiral? Because disciplined men don't collapse under pressure. They get quieter. They stop overthinking. They stop reacting. They execute what was already decided. Pressure doesn't make them emotional. It makes them efficient. That's the difference. Pressure doesn't ask who you want to be. It reveals who you practice being. And if pressure keeps knocking you off track, it's not because life is unfair. It's because your discipline was never trained under stress. Here's the shift. If you want pressure to stop breaking you, you don't fight it. You prepare for it. You build standards that don't require motivation. You build routines that don't depend on mood. You build identity that holds when everything else drops. Because pressure isn't the enemy. Unprepared men are. And once you understand that, pressure stops feeling like a threat and starts feeling like confirmation. Let me ask you something most men avoid. Who are you when no one is watching? Not when you're being evaluated. Not when there's a deadline. Not when someone expects something from you. But when there's silence. Early morning, late night, the space where no reward is guaranteed. Because that's where identity is actually built. Most men perform when they're observed and relax when they're unseen. They tighten up in public and loosen in private. And that split eventually breaks them. Here's why. Pressure doesn't care who's watching. Life won't give you a warning before it tests you. So if your discipline only exists when there's accountability, it won't survive when accountability disappears. Let me ask you a harder question. How often do you let yourself slide just because you can? No one will know. No one will call it out. No consequence today. And that's exactly why it matters. Because those moments aren't small. They're training. Every time you lower the standard in private, you teach yourself a rule. This is who I really am. And rules don't argue. They execute. That's why the strongest men you know don't talk much about discipline. They don't need to. Their habits are already locked in. They move the same way whether anyone's watching or not. Not because they're special, but because they practiced when it didn't matter. Here's the shift you need to understand. Public success is rented. Private discipline is owned. And what you own is what shows up when life applies pressure. So the question isn't whether you can perform. The question is whether you can be consistent when there's no spotlight and no immediate payoff. Because the man you are in private is the man life eventually introduces to the public. And once that introduction happens, there's no hiding from it. Let me ask you something uncomfortable. Why do so many men quit mentally long before they quit physically? They still show up. They still go through the motions. But something inside them is already preparing an exit. Have you noticed that? The backup plan, the quiet excuse, the thought that says, if this doesn't work, I can always go back. That thought feels harmless, responsible even. But here's the truth. As long as you give yourself a way out, you will never give anything your full weight. You don't fully commit to something you believe you can abandon. And the mind knows this. The moment quitting becomes possible, effort becomes conditional. You try, but not all the way. You push, but you protect yourself. You hold back just enough to avoid the pain of full responsibility. Let me ask you this. How many things in your life never reached their potential because you kept one foot pointed toward the exit? Not because you weren't capable, but because you never burned the option to retreat. Men tell themselves they're being flexible. What they're really doing is protecting comfort, and comfort is expensive. It costs focus, it costs intensity, it costs follow-through. Here's the shift. The men who change their lives remove the escape route early, not emotionally, structurally. They decide in advance that quitting is not a conversation, so when resistance shows up, and it always does, there's no debate. Only action. That's when something powerful happens. Your mind stops asking if. It starts asking how. How do I make this work? How do I adjust without quitting? How do I move forward anyway? That's a different operating system, and most men never access it because they never close the back door. Once you do, your effort changes, your focus sharpens, your standards rise, not because life got easier, but because you removed the option to escape it. And once escape disappears, commitment stops being emotional and becomes permanent. Let me ask you something most people get wrong. Why do men start strong and then fade? Why does intensity show up fast but disappear just as quickly? Because intensity feels powerful, but it's unstable. Intensity relies on emotion, on excitement, on novelty, and novelty always wears off. So, here's the real question. What happens when the excitement is gone? When the progress feels slow? When no one notices? When the work becomes repetitive? That's where most men lose. Not because they can't do the work, but because they never trained for boredom. They trained for hype. They think discipline is about pushing harder, about digging deeper emotionally. But that's not what lasts. What lasts is repetition. Repetition is quiet. Repetition is boring. Repetition doesn't feel heroic, and that's why it works. Let me ask you this. How many times have you quit something not because it was impossible, but because it became ordinary? Because the progress stopped feeling dramatic. Because the results didn't arrive fast enough to keep your emotions engaged. That's not weakness, that's untrained discipline. Repetition builds identity without asking for permission from your feelings. Every time you show up the same way, whether you feel like it or not, you install a rule. This is who I am, and rules don't argue. They execute. That's why men who rely on motivation need constant resets. But men who rely on repetition don't need motivation at all. They don't feel inspired every day. They feel committed. There's a difference. Commitment doesn't spike. It settles. It becomes normal. And when discipline becomes normal, progress compounds quietly. Not in a way you notice daily, but in a way you can't ignore over time. This is where most men misunderstand growth. They think change should feel powerful. Real change feels routine, unremarkable, predictable, almost invisible, until one day you look back and realize you're not the same man anymore. Not because you tried harder, but because you repeated what mattered long enough for it to become permanent. That's how discipline stops being something you do and starts being something you are. Let me ask you something deeper. Why does doubt disappear for some men and haunt others, no matter how much they try? Why do some men move with calm certainty while others second-guess every step? It's not confidence. Confidence is fragile. It depends on results. It rises and falls with outcomes. Certainty is different. Certainty comes from consistency. Ask yourself this: how can you trust yourself if you constantly break your own word? Every time you say you'll do something and don't follow through, you weaken your internal authority. You might not notice it immediately, but your mind does. It starts questioning you. Is he serious this time? Will he really follow through? Can I rely on him? And when your own mind stops trusting you, doubt moves in permanently. That's why so many men overthink, not because they're analytical, but because their inner authority is fractured. They haven't proven to themselves that their decisions mean anything. Let me ask you this. What if self-doubt isn't a mindset problem? What if it's a credibility problem? Think about it. You trust people who do what they say. You doubt people who don't. Your mind works the same way. Certainty is earned, not through hype, not through affirmations, through evidence. Every small follow-through is a vote for your future self. Every time you act despite resistance, you send a signal. This man means what he says, and over time, something changes. You stop arguing with yourself. You stop seeking reassurance. You stop needing permission because your mind has seen the proof. That's when doubt loses its grip. Not because life got easier, but because your identity became reliable. Reliable men don't panic under pressure. They don't spiral when plans shift. They don't collapse when results lag. They adjust and keep moving. Because certainty doesn't come from knowing the outcome. It comes from knowing yourself. Knowing that no matter what happens, you will respond with action. That knowledge is grounding. It quiets fear. It sharpens focus. It stabilizes emotion. And once that certainty is installed, external chaos loses its power over you. Because now you're no longer hoping you'll rise to the moment. You already know you will. Let me ask you something that most men underestimate. How much of your behavior is actually yours? Not what you say you value, but what you repeatedly become. Look at your environment. Who do you hear every day? What voices shape your thinking? What standards are treated as normal around you? Because no man builds in isolation. Even the strongest mind is influenced by what it's consistently exposed to. Here's the uncomfortable truth. If you spend your time around men who complain, you will normalize weakness. If you stay around men who drift, you will justify delay. If you surround yourself with people who mock discipline, your standards will erode quietly. Not all at once, not dramatically, but steadily. Let me ask you this. Have you ever noticed how certain environments make discipline feel heavy while others make it feel natural? That's not coincidence. Your surroundings either reinforce who you're becoming or pull you back toward who you were. And most men never audit this. They try to change habits without changing inputs. They want new outcomes while feeding their mind the same noise. That doesn't work. Alignment is not about motivation. It's about proximity. You rise to the level of what you tolerate and who you allow to influence you. That includes conversations, media, standards that go unchallenged. Here's the shift. Men who build intentionally become ruthless with alignment. Not arrogant, not loud, selective. They don't argue with low standards. They don't try to convert everyone. They quietly remove friction. They limit exposure to voices that weaken resolve. They increase exposure to structure, clarity, and men who live by decision instead of emotion. And once alignment is correct, discipline stops feeling like resistance. It starts feeling reinforced. Because now your environment supports the identity you're installing. This is why some men accelerate rapidly once they make a single change. Not because they found a secret, but because they stopped fighting their surroundings. They stopped swimming upstream. They aligned their inputs with the man they decided to become. And once alignment locks in, momentum follows naturally. Not fast, not flashy, but relentlessly. So let me bring this together with one final question. If you stripped away motivation, removed emotion, cut out excitement, and ignored outcomes for a moment, what would still make you move? Because whatever that answer is, that's your foundation. Most men build on feelings. That's why their progress collapses when feelings change. But builders don't rely on how they feel. They rely on what they've decided. Decision is the highest form of discipline, not a dramatic promise, not a burst of intensity, a quiet, permanent standard. Once you decide who you are, your behavior stops being negotiable. You don't ask if today counts. You don't debate whether to show up. You don't wait to feel aligned. You act because this is who you are now. That's what most men never lock in. They want results without identity, progress without standards, change without permanence, and that always breaks under pressure. But when identity is clear, everything simplifies. You don't chase discipline, you express it. You don't hunt confidence. It appears naturally. You don't fear setbacks, you adjust without drama. Because now you're not trying to become someone, you already decided. This is what it means to stop drifting. Not to feel stronger, not to look disciplined, but to operate from a standard that doesn't require permission from your emotions. From this point forward, every choice becomes simpler. Not easier, simpler. You either act in alignment or you don't, and once that line is drawn, life stops feeling confusing, because confusion only exists when standards are unclear. Decide who you are, act accordingly. That's it. That's the work, and it never stops, but it never breaks either. So here's where this leaves you. Not inspired, not hyped, not waiting, but aware. Aware that nothing changes until standards do. Aware that discipline isn't something you borrow, it's something you install. Aware that no one is coming to hand you clarity, confidence, or permission. You already know what needs to be done. You've always known. The only difference now is whether you're willing to stop negotiating with yourself. Because from this point forward, every excuse will sound thinner. Every delay will feel heavier. And every time you choose action over comfort, you reinforce the man you're becoming. Not dramatically, not publicly, permanently. This isn't about becoming extreme. It's about becoming consistent. It's about waking up and no longer asking, do I feel like it? But instead asking, does this align with who I decided to be? And acting accordingly. That's how momentum is built. That's how doubt fades. That's how identity hardens. If you're still here, you already felt the shift. So now I want you to do one final thing. Go into the comments and write one sentence. Not for me, for you. Finish this line honestly. From today forward, I will no longer negotiate with myself about Hávamál unreair. One sentence, one standard. Because when you write it, you don't just hear it. You commit to it. And if this way of thinking is what you've been missing, structure over motivation, standards over emotion, identity over hype, then subscribe, not for entertainment, but to stay aligned with the man you're building when motivation disappears. Build accordingly.